Welcome to Beyond the Page, a video series here at Coastal Carolina University in which students read from and discuss creative writing work that they've composed or written in their time here. And I'm really fortunate today to be joined by Sarah Navin, a graduate student who's pursuing her Master's of Arts in Writing here at Coastal Carolina and has actually had work appear in publications like Gone Lawn and the Allegheny Review, and even forthcoming from the Normal School, and has an honorable mention for a recent piece listed by Glimmer Train. I've asked Sarah here today to read her wonderfully titled poem, On Stage, the Beauty Queen Remembers She Left the Stove Light On, and then to speak with me, I'm Hastings Hensel, afterwards about it and about writing in general. Thanks for being here, Sarah.
Thanks for having me.
Love to hear your poem.
Thanks. So this is On Stage, the Beauty Queen Remembers She Left the Stove On. Sizzling footlights, victorious trumpet song, a standing ovation, and gleaming curls of foil confetti raining down from the auditorium rafters. Somebody hands her a rose bouquet, which she cradles in the crook of her arm. Someone else places the tiara, lets its metal teeth cut into the skin behind her blushing ears, too close to the pink-white bone of her skull. The roaring, teeming crowd, the rising music, her own dizzy pulse. It's all so bright and loud that she slips free from her body, leaves it there in a snakeskin of sequins and chiffon, and floats all the way home. Then, back on stage, she knows the applause must be muting the distant throb of sirens. In the sudden spread of every shutter flash, she sees drapes blackened by blue flame. The melted kettle collapsed into itself, puddling into molten metal while the cabinets ignite like kindling. The silverware on the drying rack glows sunset hues before it turns to lava too. All the meat in the freezer is charred, soda cans erupt like cherry bombs, the wallpaper coils inward, the sink full of dirty dishwater boils, the windows steam, the glasses break, and she is glittering, glowing. Someone's laughing and holding the dark plush dome of a microphone to her mouth. Her lips part, a stretching thread of cherry gloss connects the two, heat floods the room, and she tries to get the words out.
Thank you. It's such a wonderfully titled poem and a terrific portrait, I think, of a fictional character. I wanted to ask you, can you tell me a little bit about how this beauty queen came to you, and perhaps how this specific moment of being on stage and remembering the stove light on came to you? Is that possible to even say?
Sure. So I already have this fascination with, I guess, hyper-performative femininity. There's a sort of ghoulishness there that's really fun to play with to begin with. That's present in beauty pageants, prom queen crownings, those kinds of things. So that's already really fertile ground. But I typically end up, especially in my prose, writing about sort of the best friend of the beauty queen, the quieter companion, and the idea for this was written down initially as just write something from the perspective of the beauty queen for once. And so that's where she as a character came from. But as for the oven light, I couldn't have told you about that until we had the discussion in our class in the workshop about it.
Right.
Because people really seem to resonate with a character that's so neurotic that they can be in the most euphoric moment of their life and still be imagining in great detail what could be going terribly wrong off screen. And as we were talking about it, I was just thinking, that's me. Like, that's 100% me.
Yeah.
So I had fully projected, but up until then, I would have never been able to tell you what the stove was about.
It reminded me when I was a kid, we would go on vacation, and one time my mother turned around about halfway there thinking she'd left the iron on, and we got home and the iron was not on.
Of course not, yeah.
Of course not. So one thing I love about the poem and really your work in general is the sounds. The assonance, weeping freely, cheeks streaked, sibilants and snake skin of sequins and chiffon. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the importance or use of sound and music in your poetry, and even perhaps in your fiction.
Well, Dr. Albergati really likes to remind us of necessity being the mother of invention.
Yeah.
And I find that when I keep myself to really musical language in my writing, that sort of compels me to move from idea to idea and word to word.
Yeah.
Snakeskin in particular is just this really inherently beautiful word that I was just privileged enough to be able to slip in there. Also because it has that sort of hissing, slithering sound, but I wanted it to kind of ease off into some similar but different sounds, which is why I ended up with the organization of snakeskin and then sequins and chiffon.
Right.
So each subsequent word I wanted to sort of get a little bit further away from that sound while still maintaining the feeling. And going for a really musical language is one of the ways that I keep myself moving from line to line, and it's also, as a fiction writer, one of the ways that I make sure that I'm not just writing prose, because it's very easy to slip back into.
I like that idea of that's how you move from line to line, as if the right word can sometimes be the word that sounds the best, as opposed to means the most or something. You've written, and this is from some prose you've written, that you were drawn to, quote, the blurry line between laughter and tears, between a punchline and a sickening sense of dread. I love that. This poem for me really embodies and enacts that idea. Can you talk a little more about the concept and how it comes out in your writing in this poem, or even in this poem in particular?
Yeah. So I think culturally there's already this huge overlap between the idea of dread and darkness and then laughter and comedy. We've got like gallows humor and the audible similarity between laughter and crying and those kinds of things. That's something that I've always been really interested in, but in particular I just feel like there's such an easy bridge between something that's really upsetting and something that's very funny and very absurd. My boyfriend had a nightmare where Alf, like the puppet, was crawling towards him on a floor at like hyperspeed, and that's both the funniest thing I've ever heard and also the scariest thing to think about in the dark, and it's just this bizarre comparison. And I guess I'm constantly torn between wanting to be emotionally vulnerable in my writing and also not being able to take myself seriously at all. So I end up coming at the emotional core of the piece from the most absurd angle I can possibly take. And that's definitely what was happening here, and it's definitely something that, I don't know, I kind of struggle with, I guess.
Well, I think that in this poem you enter with a kind of bizarre or even absurd angle or humorous angle, but by the end you kind of break our hearts a little bit with the last lines. And I was going to ask you about that, the theme or the concept of speechlessness and its relationship to performance and anxiety. You've spoken a little bit about that, but the last lines of this poem are, quote, and she tries to get the words out. But those words never come, at least in the poem. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the themes of speechlessness and the relationship they have to performance and anxiety, either in this poem or generally.
One of my favorite poems is T.S. Eliot's The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And one of my favorite lines from that, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's a character saying, that is not what I meant, that is not what I meant at all, after speaking. And there's something so quietly sad about the idea of not being able to express yourself properly to someone else. So the anxiety that I keep coming back to in a lot of my work and that I was trying to channel here is not necessarily the anxiety of saying something and it being the wrong thing or it being unacceptable, but saying something and not having it truly convey the breadth of what you're trying to express. So the idea of whatever is going to come out of my mouth next will not be a cohesive and true reflection of what I'm trying to tell another human, because something's always lost in translation, and that's something that's so tricky and so universal and so touching to me coming out in that poem in J. Alfred Prufrock that I find myself coming back to it a lot. So this moment at the end of this poem, the character is stuck kind of between these two realities that she's created, one in which she is physically having a good time and she's successful, but then she's also sandwiched between this other world of the possible terror that could be taking place. So that speechlessness, I think, is really the act of being between your imagined world and the present one. Hopefully.
It seems to me, among other things, that it could be a good figure for the writer's dilemma too. You know, this idea of what we're trying to express, and often inhabiting the worst case scenario in our heads. couple of more questions. You write prose too, so you write fiction and I think nonfiction. I've always been curious about and interested in what subjects or moments become poems, what subjects or moments become get rendered in prose. What do you think? I mean, is something you immediately know when an idea or image comes to you, this is a poem, or does it take some deliberate, work to figure that out?
I wish it's something I immediately knew.
Yeah.
I mean, I find that I end up gravitating towards the poetic form when an idea really intimidates me. Especially one of the pieces that I wrote for your course about Evelyn McHale, who was dubbed the world's most beautiful suicide. When I came across her story, everything about it was writable, and everything about it seemed like good fodder for, some emotional resonance in a piece.
Right.
But because it was such a big story, because it was essentially her entire life and her identity, it was completely overwhelming. And I knew that if I sat down and gave myself the space and the freedom of prose to try to tackle that, it was going to last forever and I would never finish it.
Yeah.
And so I ended up not only writing it as a poem, but writing it as an imitation of someone else's form, just to really restrict myself. Because I feel like poetry is a way to force myself to identify the aspect of an idea or a story that is the most urgent to me.
Okay.
And I love prose dearly, but poetry really does put me against a wall sometimes in a really constructive way.
Yeah.
Because if I know that I have given myself a certain line length and a certain number of lines, then I have to identify what is the most important. What do I really truly want to say about this subject?
I like that a lot. You've been writing for quite a while now, and this is just my last question. And I'm just sort of wondering, what advice you might give to poets and writers, undergraduates, or people just starting out. Any practical or existential advice that you might consider relaying to them?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we hear a lot in the writing community is write what you know, especially in workshops and when you're starting out. And I think that is good advice, but something else that it's not my idea, but I'd like to pass it on, is that there's kind of a second addendum to that statement, which is, but know interesting things.
Yeah.
So write what you know, but make sure that you're also supplementing that with going out in your actual natural life and putting yourself in interesting, strange situations and learning interesting things, so that you can write with intimate familiarity about things that are maybe beyond what you would have typically encountered.
Yeah.
So I've placed myself in so many very weird situations just because I looked at it from the perspective of someone who writes, and I thought it's too good to pass up.
Right.
And I think making those conscious choices, knowing that you can kind of you can tool through that for ideas later on, is a really important part of making yourself a flexible writer.
That's so terrific, and it really shows in your work. There's a wide range of both subject matter and tone that I think it comes from experience, but also probably the experience of reading too.
Yeah.
And you've mentioned this. Maybe this will be our last question. Who are some of your favorite writers, and who are you reading now?
Well, right now, I would say probably Jeffrey Eugenides of the Virgin Suicides is one of my favorites. I really do enjoy Flannery O'Connor, and I've drawn a lot of my setting work in my prose from her.
Yeah.
But at any time that someone asks me about who influences my texts, I'm always thinking of John Darnielle of the band The Mountain Goats.
Okay.
It's my favorite band, and he's a songwriter. He's also written novels, but his lyrics have influenced my poetry so much just because those hyper-specific titles, like on a highway in, Tallahassee, Florida or something like that, it really helps ground you, and I think I've pulled a lot of that from him.
I do too, and thank you so much for sharing and reading your wonderfully titled poem at this wonderfully titled video series, Beyond the Page, and hope to have you back. Thanks.
Thank you, I hope so too.
All right.